The Long Shadow of Empire, 1763 to 1793, French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. 1754 to 63, the French and Indian War was the North American conflict in a larger imperial war between Great Britain and France, known as the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War began in 1754 and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The war provided Great Britain enormous territorial gains in North America. But disputes over subsequent frontier policy and paying the war's expenses led to colonial discontent and ultimately to the American Revolution. The French and Indian War resulted from ongoing frontier tensions in North America as both French and British imperial officials and colonists sought to extend each country's sphere of influence in frontier regions. In North America, the war pitted French colonists, and their native allies against Great Britain, the Anglo-American colonists, and the Iroquois Confederacy, which controlled most of upstate New York and parts of northern Pennsylvania. In 1753, prior to the outbreak of hostilities, Great Britain controlled the 13 colonies up to the Appalachian Mountains. But beyond lay New France, a very large, sparsely settled colony that stretched from Louisiana through the Mississippi Valley and Great Lakes to Canada. See incidents leading up to the French and Indian War in Albany. Planned the border between French and British possessions was not well defined, and one disputed territory was the Upper Ohio River Valley. The French had constructed a number of forts in this region in an attempt to strengthen their claim on the territory. British colonial forces, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, attempted to expel the French in 1754, but were outnumbered and defeated by the French. When news of Washington's failure reached British Prime Minister Thomas Pelham Hollis, Duke of Newcastle, he called for a quick, undeclared retaliatory strike. However, his adversaries in the cabinet outmaneuvered him by making the plans public, thus alerting the French government and escalating a distant frontier skirmish into a full-scale war. The war did not begin well for the British. The British government sent General Edward Braddock to the colonies as Commander-in-Chief of British North American forces. But he alienated potential Indian allies, and colonial leaders failed to cooperate with him. On July 13, 1755, Braddock died after being mortally wounded in an ambush on a failed expedition to capture Fort Duquesne in present-day Pittsburgh. The war in North America settled into a stalemate for the next several years. While in Europe, the French scored an important naval victory and captured the British possession of Minorca in the Mediterranean in 1756. However, after 1757, the war began to turn in favor of Great Britain. British forces defeated French forces in India, and in 1759, British armies invaded and conquered Canada. Facing defeat in North America and a tenuous position in Europe, the French government attempted to engage the British in peace negotiations. But British Minister William Pitt, the Elder, Secretary for Southern Affairs, sought not only the French cession of Canada, but also commercial concessions that the French government found unacceptable. After these negotiations failed, Spanish King Charles III offered to come to the aid of his cousin, French King Louis XV, and their representatives signed an alliance known as the Family Compact. On August 15, 1761, the terms of the agreement stated that Spain would declare war on Great Britain if the war did not end before May 1, 1762, originally intended to pressure the British into a peace agreement. The Family Compact ultimately reinvigorated the French will to continue the war and caused the British government to declare war on Spain on January 4, 1762. After bitter infighting among King George III's ministers, despite facing such a formidable alliance, British naval strength and Spanish ineffectiveness led to British success. British forces seized French Caribbean islands, Spanish Cuba, and the Philippines. Fighting in Europe ended, after a failed Spanish invasion of British ally Portugal. By 1763, French and Spanish diplomats began to seek peace. In the resulting Treaty of Paris, 1763, Great Britain secured significant territorial gains in North America, including all French territory east of the Mississippi River, as well as Spanish Florida, although the treaty returned Cuba to Spain. Unfortunately, for the British, the fruits of victory brought seeds of trouble with Great Britain's American colonies. The war had been enormously expensive, and the British government's attempts to impose taxes on colonists to help cover these expenses resulted in increasing colonial resentment of British attempts to expand imperial authority in the colonies. British attempts to limit Western expansion by colonists and inadvertent provocation of a major Indian war further angered the British subjects living in the American colonies. These disputes ultimately spurred colonial rebellion, which eventually developed into a full-scale war for independence. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 *. The Royal Proclamation is a foundational document in the relationship between First Nations people and the Crown, and laid the basis for Canada's territorial evolution. On October 7, 1763, King George Roman numeral III issued a royal proclamation, establishing a new administrative structure for the recently acquired territories in North America. He also established new rules and protocols for future relations with First Nations people. The proclamation has two parts of significance, defining the land west of the established colonies as Indian territories, where First Nations people should not be molested or disturbed by settlers, and where the Indian Department would be the primary liaison between the Crown and First Nations people, prohibiting colonial governors from making any grants or taking any land cessions from First Nations people by establishing a set of protocols and procedures for the purchasing of First Nations lands. Its issuance in 1763. The Royal Proclamation has served as a basis of the treaty-making process throughout Canada and is referred to in the Section 25 of the Constitution, Act 1982. The proclamation and the accompanying promises made at Fort Niagara in 1764 laid the foundation for a constitutional recognition and protection of First Nations rights in Canada. Royal Proclamation of 1763. There is one existing English copy of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in the Library and Archives Canada collection. There are 3 contemporary copies in the United States and 1 in the UK. There is no absolutely faithful French translation of the proclamation. The translation in the appendices to the Revised Statutes of Canada, 1985, contains several errors that distort the meaning of the original provisions. The following text is derived from a reproduction of the original proclamation, printed by the King's printer, Mark Basket, in London in 1763. * 1763. October 7, by the King. A proclamation George R. Whereas we have taken into our royal consideration the extensive and valuable acquisitions in America, secured to our crown by the late definitive Treaty of Peace, concluded at Paris the 10th day of February last, and being desirous that all our loving subjects, as well of our kingdoms, as of our colonies in America, may avail themselves with all convenient speed of the great benefits and advantages which must accrue therefrom to their commerce, manufactures, and navigation. We have thought fit, with the advice of our Privy Council, to issue this our royal proclamation, hereby to publish and declare to all our loving subjects that we have, with the advice of our said Privy Council, granted our letters patent under our Great Seal of Great Britain to erect within the countries and islands ceded and confirmed to us by the said treaty 4 distinct and separate governments, styled and called by the names of Quebec, East Florida, West Florida, and Grenada, and limited and bounded as follows. Viz. First, the government of Quebec, bounded on the Labrador coast by the River St. John, and from thence by a line drawn from the head of that river through the Lake St. John to the south end of the lake, nigh Kissing, from whence the said line, crossing the river St. Lawrence and the Lake Champlain in 45 degrees of north latitude, passes along the high lands which divide the rivers that empty themselves into the said river St. Lawrence, from those which fall into the sea, and also along the north coast of the Baie des Chaleurs and the coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence to Cape Rosiers, and from thence crossing the mouth of the river St. Lawrence by the west end of the island of Anticosti, terminates at the aforesaid river of St. John. Secondly, the government of East Florida, bounded to the westward by the Gulf of Mexico and the Apalachicola River, to the northward by a line drawn from that part of the said river where the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers meet, to the source of St. Mary's River, and by the course of the said river to the Atlantic Ocean, and to the eastward and southward, by the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Florida, including all islands within 6 leagues of the seacoast. Thirdly, the government of West Florida, bounded to the southward by the Gulf of Mexico, including all islands within 6 leagues of the coast from the river Apalachicola to Lake Pontchartrain, to the westward by the said lake, the Lake Maurepas, and the river Mississippi, to the northward by a line drawn due east from that part of the river Mississippi, which lies in 31 degrees north latitude, to the river Apalachicola or Chattahoochee, and to the eastward by the said river. Fourthly, the government of Grenada, comprehending the island of that name, together with the Grenadines, and the islands of Dominico, St. Vincent's, and Tobago, and to the end that the open and free fishery of our subjects may be extended to and carried on upon the coast of Labrador and the adjacent islands, we have thought fit, with the advice of our said Privy Council, to put all that coast, from the river St. John's to Hudson's Straits, together with the islands of Anticosti and Madeleine, and all other smaller islands lying upon the said coast, under the care and inspection of our Governor of Newfoundland. We have also, with the advice of our Privy Council, thought fit to annex the islands of St. John's and Cape Breton, or Isle Royale, with the lesser islands adjacent thereto, to our government of Nova Scotia. We have also, with the advice of our Privy Council aforesaid, annexed to our province of Georgia all the lands lying between the rivers Attamaha and St. Mary's, and whereas it will greatly contribute to the speedy settling our said new governments, that our loving subjects should be informed of our paternal care for the security of the liberties and properties of those who are and shall become inhabitants thereof, we have thought fit to publish and declare by this our proclamation that we have in the letters patent under our Great Seal of Great Britain, by which the said governments are constituted, given express power and direction to our governors of our said colonies respectively, that so soon as the state and circumstances of the said colonies will admit thereof, they shall, with the advice and consent of the members of our council, summon and call general assemblies within the said governments respectively, in such manner and form as is used and directed in those colonies and provinces in America, which are under our immediate government. And we have also given power to the said governors, with the consent of our said councils and the representatives of the people, so to be summoned as aforesaid, to make, constitute, and ordain laws, statutes, and ordinances for the public peace, welfare, and good government of our said colonies, and of the people and inhabitants thereof, as near as may be agreeable to the laws of England, and under such regulations and restrictions as are used in other colonies, and in the meantime, and until such assemblies can be called as aforesaid, all persons inhabiting in or resorting to our said colonies may confide in our royal protection for the enjoyment of the benefit of the laws of our realm of England, for which purpose we have given power under our Great Seal to the governors of our said colonies respectively, to erect and constitute, with the advice of our said councils respectively, courts of judicature and public justice within our said colonies for the hearing and determining all causes, as well criminal as civil, according to law and equity, and as near as may be agreeable to the laws of England, with liberty to all persons who may think themselves aggrieved by the sentences of such courts in all civil cases to appeal, under the usual limitations and restrictions, to us in our Privy Council. We have also thought fit, with the advice of our Privy Council as aforesaid, to give unto the governors and councils of our said 3 new colonies upon the continent full power and authority to settle and agree with the inhabitants of our said new colonies, or with any other persons who shall resort thereto, for such lands, tenements, and hereditaments, as are now or hereafter shall be in our power to dispose of, and them to grant to any such person or persons, upon such terms, and under such moderate quittance, services and acknowledgments as have been appointed and settled in our other colonies, and under such other conditions as shall appear to used to be necessary and expedient for the advantage of the grantees, and the improvement and settlement of our said colonies. And whereas we are desirous, upon all occasions, to testify our royal sense and approbation of the conduct and bravery of the officers and soldiers of our armies, and to reward the same, we do hereby command and empower our governors of our said 3 new colonies, and all other our governors of our several provinces on the continent of North America, to grant, without fee or reward, to such reduced officers as have served in North America during the late war, and to such private soldiers as have been or shall be disbanded in America, and are actually residing there, and shall personally apply for the same the following quantities of lands, subject at the expiration of 10 years to the same quittance as other lands are subject to in the province within which they are granted, as also subject to the same conditions of cultivation and improvement, viz. to every person having the rank of a field officer, 5,000 acres, to every captain, 3,000 acres, to every subaltern or staff officer, 2,000 acres, to every non-commissioned officer, 200 acres, to every private man, 50 acres. We do likewise authorize and require the governors and commanders-in-chief of all our said colonies upon the continent of North America to grant the like quantities of land, and upon the same conditions to such reduced officers of our Navy of like rank, as served on board our ships of war in North America at the times of the reduction of Louisbourg and Quebec in the late war, and who shall personally apply to our respective governors for such grants. And whereas it is just and reasonable, and essential to our interest and the security of our colonies, that the several nations or tribes of Indians, with whom we are connected and who live under our protection, should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to, or purchased by us, are reserved to them, or any of them, as their hunting grounds. We do therefore, with the advice of our Privy Council, declare it to be our royal will and pleasure, that no governor or commander-in-chief in any of our colonies of Quebec, East Florida, or West Florida do presume, upon any pretense whatever, to grant warrants of survey or pass any patents for lands beyond the bounds of their respective governments, as described in their commissions, as also that no governor or commander-in-chief in any of our other colonies or plantations in America do presume, for the present, and until our further pleasure be known, to grant warrants of survey or pass patents for any lands beyond the heads or sources of any of the rivers which fall into the Atlantic Ocean from the west and northwest, or upon any lands whatever, which, not having been ceded to or purchased by us as aforesaid, are reserved to the said Indians or any of them, and we do further declare it to be our royal will and pleasure, for the present, as aforesaid, to reserve under our sovereignty, protection, and dominion, for the use of the said Indians, all the lands and territories not included within the limits of our said 3 new governments, or within the limits of the territory granted to the Hudson's Bay Company, also all the lands and territories lying to the A, westward of the sources of the rivers which fall into the sea from the west and northwest, as aforesaid. And we do hereby strictly forbid, on pain of our displeasure, all our loving subjects from making any purchases or settlements whatever, or taking possession of any of the lands above reserved, without our especial leave and license for that purpose first obtained. And we do further strictly enjoin and require all persons whatever, who have either willfully or inadvertently seated themselves upon any lands within the countries above described, or upon any other lands, which, not having been ceded to, or purchased by us, are still reserved to the said Indians as aforesaid, forthwith to remove themselves from such settlements. And whereas great frauds and abuses have been committed in the purchasing lands of the Indians, to the great prejudice of our interests, and to the great dissatisfaction of the said Indians, in order therefore to prevent such irregularities for the future, and to the end that the Indians may be convinced of our justice, and determined resolution to remove all reasonable cause of discontent, we do, with the advice of our Privy Council, strictly enjoin and require that no private person do presume to make any purchase from the said Indians of any lands reserved to the said Indians, within those parts of our colonies where we have thought proper to allow settlement. But that if, at any time, any of the said Indians should be inclined to dispose of the said lands, that same shall be purchased only for us, in our name, at some public meeting or assembly of the said Indians, to be held for that purpose by the Governor or Commander-in-Chief of our colonies respectively, within which they shall lie, and in case they shall lie within the limits of any proprietary government, they shall be purchased only for the use and in the name of such proprietaries, conformable to such directions and instructions as we, or they shall think proper to give for that purpose, and we do, by the advice of our Privy Council, declare and enjoin that the trade with the said Indians shall be free and open to all our subjects whatever, provided that every person who may incline to trade with the said Indians do take out a license for carrying on such trade from the Governor or Commander-in-Chief of any of our colonies respectively, where such person shall reside, and also give security to observe such regulations as we shall at any time think fit, by ourselves or by our commissaries to be appointed for this purpose, to direct and appoint for the benefit of the said trade. And we do hereby authorize, enjoin, and require the governors and commanders-in-chief of all our colonies respectively, as well those under our immediate government as those under the government and direction of proprietaries, to grant such licenses, without fee or reward, taking especial care to insert therein a condition that such license shall be void, and the security forfeited in case the person to whom the same is granted shall refuse or neglect to observe such regulations as we shall think proper to prescribe as aforesaid. And we do further expressly enjoin and require all officers whatever, as well military as those employed in the management and direction of Indian affairs within the territories reserved as aforesaid for the use of the said Indians, to seize and apprehend all persons whatever, who, standing charged with treasons, misprisions of treason, murders, or other felonies or misdemeanors, shall fly from justice and take refuge in the said territory, and to send them under a proper guard to the colony where the crime was committed of which they stand accused, in order to take their trial for the same dot given at our court at St. James's, the 7th day of October, 1763. In the 3rd year of our reign, God save the King London, printed by Mark Basket, printer to the King's Most Excellent Majesty, and by the assigns of Robert Basket, 1763. First shots of war, 1775 *, for some months. People in the colonies had been gathering arms and powder, and had been training to fight the British, if necessary, at a moment's notice. The Continental Congress had approved of preparations for defensive fighting in case the British made an aggressive move. But General Thomas Gage, commander of British troops in Boston, had been cautious. He thought his army too small to act without reinforcements. On the other hand, his officers disdained the colonists as fighters. Thinking they would flee with any show of British force, Gage received orders to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock, rumored to be near Lexington. When Gage heard that the colonists had stockpiled guns and powder in Concord, he decided to act. On the night of April 18, 1775, he dispatched nearly 1,000 troops from Boston. He hoped to catch the colonists by surprise and thus to avoid bloodshed. But all British activities were carefully watched by the Patriots and William Dawes and Paul Revere rode out to warn people in the countryside that the British were coming. When British regulars, known as Redcoats because of their uniform jackets, arrived at Lexington the next morning, they found several dozen Minutemen waiting for them. On the town's common, someone fired. No one knows who fired first, and 8 Minutemen were killed and another dozen or so were wounded. Then the British marched on Concord and destroyed what was left of the store of guns and powder, most of which had been hastily removed by the Patriots. During the Redcoats' entire march back to Boston, Minutemen harassed them, firing from behind fences, houses, trees, and rocks. By the end of the day, the Redcoats suffered 3 times more casualties than had the colonists. Whatever the truth of who fired the first shot, the Patriots were first to get their version of the events out to the American public. The effect was to rally hundreds, if not thousands, of colonists to the rebellion. When the Second Continental Congress met 3 weeks later, the meeting had been scheduled since October. It agreed to support Massachusetts in the conflict. Even so, many representatives disagreed among themselves about the purpose of the fighting. At one end of the continuum of opinion were such men as Sam and John Adams of Massachusetts and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who already favored independence. At the other end of that continuum were such men as John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who hoped for a quick settlement and reconciliation with Great Britain. Most delegates, like most colonists, were moderates with opinions somewhere in the middle. Of that continuum, over the next year of conflict, bungling British policymakers tried to recruit Indians, slaves, and foreign mercenaries. They blockaded colonial ports and they rejected alliances and conciliation. These actions pushed more and more colonists to favor independence. For additional documents related to these topics, search loc.gov using such keywords as General Thomas Gage, Richard Henry Lee, Peyton Randolph, Minutemen, specific dates such as April 18, 1775, and the terms found in the documents. Another strategy is to browse relevant collections by date. Creating a Continental Army according to Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton. The military strategy the general would pursue throughout the Revolutionary War was as follows. Our hopes are not placed in any particular city or spot of ground, but in preserving a good army, to take advantage of favorable opportunities and waste and defeat the enemy by piecemeal. In order to preserve a good army, one had to be created in the first place. It was a long and difficult road from the Continental Congress's edict to designate the militia around Boston as a Continental Army, and creating such an army in fact. Although many colonials had had some military experience in the French and Indian War, most had served in militia units, a far cry from service in a regular European-style army. The latter, Washington believed, was what the Continental Army needed to become if the colonies were to stand up to the British Army, as Washington put the matter shortly after he arrived in Boston. To take command of the army, the course of human affairs forbids an expectation that troops formed under such circumstances. Militia should at once possess the order, regularity, and discipline of veterans. Washington rather optimistically added, "Whatever deficiencies there may be, will, I doubt not, soon be made up by the activity and zeal of the officers, and the docility and obedience of the men." These qualities united with their native bravery, and and spirit will afford a happy presage of success. How this opinion would soon change. When Washington assumed his duties in Boston, he saw no end to problems. The abuses problems in this army, I fear, are considerable. And the new modeling of it, reorganization, in the face of an enemy, from whom we every hour expect an attack, is exceedingly difficult and dangerous. Although often dismayed by his charge, Washington set out to create an army that could stand up in the field to the best army in the world at that time. The documents included here will give you a sense of some of the problems and issues. These and other problems continued to plague Washington and his army throughout the conflict. Over time, Washington would come to believe that only the creation of a permanent standing army could save the revolution. For additional documents related to these topics, search the Library of Congress using such keywords as Continental Army, militia, and recruitment. Browse Washington's general orders and his letters to the presidents of the Continental Congress. By dates of specific battles, for example, and terms found in the documents, Revolutionary War, Northern Front. 1775 to 1777 in the first 18 months of armed conflict with the British, the conflict would not become a war for independence until July 4, 1776. Washington had begun to create an army and forced the British Army in Boston to evacuate that city in March 1776. The major question after their evacuation was what they would do next. Washington was almost certain that the British would attack New York, since that position was of critical importance for their operations both north and south. Besides, that is what he would have done had he been in Sir William Howe's shoes. Even though his premonition eventually proved true. British intentions did not become clear until their fleet descended upon New York in August 1776. For a variety of reasons, Washington and his generals made a number of mistakes during the engagements in the New York area. These mistakes and Britain's far superior naval power led to decided British victories on Long Island and on Manhattan. Had the British commanders been a bit more aggressive, their naval power might have put the Continental Army at great risk of total defeat. After Washington was driven from Manhattan, his army fought Howe's forces to a standstill at White Plains. Even so, the British were now in control of New York City. Again, the question became, what would the British do next? Washington thought the logical next step for them to do was to move on Philadelphia, so he moved most of his army south into New Jersey. Indeed, British forces under General Charles Lord Cornwallis chased and harassed the Continentals all the way through New Jersey. When Washington's army reached Trenton Falls, their fortunes seemed at low ebb. Surprisingly, at that point, Howe ordered his army into winter quarters rather than attacking the Americans. Seizing the opportunity Howe presented him, Washington counterattacked at Trenton in late December 1776, and then at Princeton in early 1777. What Washington had done in 9 days was truly staggering. Just when many Americans thought all was lost, Washington had produced 2 major victories over one of the world's most powerful armies. Trenton and Princeton tended to put to rest the second-guessing about Washington's leadership, a belief that had grown as the Continental Army suffered defeats in New York and then retreated through New Jersey. These victories had also been watched closely by many European leaders. They now came to view Washington as an adroit and able commander. On the other hand, the British were not impressed with Washington's accomplishments. All in all, Lord North thought 1776 had been a very good year for the British. They had retained Canada and captured New York City. Their losses of soldiers had not been great, and nearly 40,000 Loyalists had received pardons from Howe. British leaders would also have been heartened had they fully known what Washington knew about the chronic problems experienced by the Continental Army. Washington was continually concerned with problems of the militia. recruits, and deserters, and he constantly reminded Congress of the need for a standing professional army and a better system of supply. For additional documents related to these topics, search loc.gov using such keywords as Boston, Long Island, Manhattan, White Plains, New Jersey, Trenton, Princeton, and General Howe. Search Washington's papers by date of specific battles, for example, and use the terms found in the documents. Revolutionary War, the turning point, 1776 to 1777, asterisk, in 1777. The British were still in excellent position to quell the rebellion. Had it not been for a variety of mistakes, they probably could have won the war. Asterisk, during early 1777, British officials considered a number of plans for their upcoming campaign. One they apparently decided upon was to campaign through the Hudson River Valley and thereby cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. General William Howe was to drive north from New York City, while General John Burgoyne was to drive south from Canada. Meanwhile, British General Barry St. Leger would drive down the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York. The major problem was not with the plan, but with its execution. Historians continue to debate whether Howe was ill-informed or simply acted on his own. Whatever the reasons, Howe decided to capture Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress. Rather than to work in concert with Burgoyne and St. Leger, Howe hoped that by seizing Philadelphia, he would rally the Loyalists in Pennsylvania, discourage the rebels by capturing their capital, and bring the war to a speedy conclusion. Washington tried to thwart Howe's plan, but Howe outmaneuvered him at Brandywine Creek and then at Germantown. While Howe's forces settled into winter quarters in Philadelphia, the Continental Army went into winter quarters at Valley Forge. There, the army faced deprivation in the extreme. Meanwhile, to the north, Burgoyne and St. Leger suffered significant defeats at Oriskany, New York, Bennington, Vermont, and finally at Saratoga, New York. These American victories were critical, for they helped convince France to recognize American independence and brought the French directly into the war as military allies. The French treaty was also a result of a new British peace proposal, announced by Lord North in late 1777. The French were concerned that the Americans would agree to North's proposal, since it offered them virtual autonomy within the British Empire. The French alliance changed the face of the war for the British. The American War for Independence was now, in essence, a world war. Even so, as many of the documents listed to the right suggest, winning the war, even after the French treaty, was still not a certainty. For additional documents related to these topics, search loc.gov using such keywords as Howe, Burgoyne, Gates, Saratoga, Philadelphia, Brandywine, Germantown, Valley Forge, France, and Vergennes, the French foreign minister. Search Washington's papers and the journals of the Continental Congress by date of specific battles, for example, and use the terms found in the documents to the right of the page. Asterisk, Revolutionary War, Southern Phase, 1778 to 1781. Asterisk, the Continental victory at Saratoga in 1777 and the treaty with the French in 1778 transformed the war, especially for the British. Increased French aid to the Continentals was very slow in coming. Coordinated military activity between the two new allies was even slower to happen. Meanwhile, the British were immediately faced with a global conflict with France. As a result, the British changed their strategy yet again in 1778. Rather than mounting a full-scale military campaign against the Continental Army, the British decided to focus their efforts on the Loyalists, who they still believed were the majority of the American population, asterisk, believing the Loyalists were strongest in the South, and hoping to enlist the slaves in their cause, an objective that seems incompatible with a focus on Southern Loyalists. The British turned their efforts to the South. In fact, the British had some important military successes in the South. They occupied Savannah, Georgia in late 1778 and Charleston, South Carolina in May 1779. They also struck a disastrous blow on General Horatio Gates' forces at Camden, South Carolina, in August 1780. Although the British were successful in most conventional battles, the fighting in the South, under the leadership of Generals Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan, turned toward guerrilla and hit-and-run warfare. Moreover, the British had overestimated Loyalist sentiment in the South. Their presence actually forced many who had been sitting out the war to take sides, most in favor of the Patriots. At the same time, the British underestimated the logistical problems they would encounter, especially when their army was in the interior away from the supplies offered by their fleet. Patriot forces, on the other hand, were supplied and could hide among the local population. As a result, the British Southern strategy was a dismal failure. For additional documents related to these topics, search loc.gov using such keywords as Henry Clinton, Charles Cornwallis, Nathaniel Greene, Daniel Morgan. Such battles as Camden, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and individual Southern states and cities. Search Washington's papers and the journals of the Continental Congress by date of specific battles, for example, and use the terms found in the documents. Asterisk, Revolutionary War, the home front. Asterisk, defining a home front in the Revolutionary War is difficult because so much of the 13 states became, at one time or another, an actual theater of war. Even so, the war profoundly affected the domestic scene, and the domestic scene, in turn, greatly influenced the conduct and course of the war. Asterisk, most Native American tribes east of the Mississippi were uncertain about which side, if either, to take during the Revolutionary War, and many remained neutral. A number of tribes, however, feared the revolution would replace the British, who had worked hard to protect their lands from colonial encroachments with the land-hungry colonials. As a result, these tribes fought with the British or took advantage of the situation and acted against the colonists on their own. Patriots viewed the Indians as a threat throughout the war. The Patriots' use of the term savages for the Native Americans gives a good indication of their overall attitude toward most tribes. For some African Americans, the revolution meant freedom. Because so much of the fighting in the last years of the war took place in the South, many slaves escaped to British lines. The British, hoping to weaken the American war effort, emancipated and evacuated thousands of ex-slaves. A few African Americans also won their freedom by fighting in the Continental Army despite the prejudices of Patriot leaders. This attitude changed somewhat during the course of the war. For the vast majority of African Americans, however, the liberties touted by the American Revolution remained more promise than reality. Women's lives were also profoundly affected by the Revolutionary War. Women whose husbands and other male relatives went to war had to assume many of their responsibilities, whether it be the farm or small business, since Continental Army soldiers were typically drawn from the lower ranks of society. Many women did not have farms and businesses to fall back on. Cities throughout the United States witnessed growing populations of impoverished women. Many women did not stay at home when their husbands went off to war. These women flocked to the army camps to join male relatives. There they helped maintain army morale while doing traditional women's chores, cooking, laundry, nursing, and so forth. In many respects, the Revolutionary War was a civil war. First, most of the land war was fought on United States soil. Second, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population retained their loyalty to the crown. In some places, the Loyalists actively opposed the Patriots through propaganda, spying, military service with the British, and sometimes insurrectionary activities. Loyalist propaganda continually planted seeds of dissension within the wider population. Patriots continuously perceived Loyalist threats on the home front and actively worked to quiet the Loyalists, arrest them, and confiscate their property. Because the Continental Congress was unable to levy taxes to pay for the war, It relied on the printing press to issue nearly $250 million in paper money, the so-called Continental. The paper money was backed only by the good faith of the Congress. Because of dislocations in trade and manufacturing, there was too much money competing for too few goods. The result was uncontrolled inflation. In early 1780, the Congress confessed that its money was worthless, something the people had known long before, as evidenced in their popular slash and their popular slash texture, and the movie slash abounds on scared slash, and leaves a rich, long-lasting color, and leaves a rich, long-lasting color, and lash slash common may, the provi slash abows, by this common like a lass, its bows cocaine, mel lass, wellix lad, so, it's like, the way to sell it. Why not? My susek, kapai less, ikapadzik, a sawada guttinset, the kali laskit kakakadset, I may say let I'm sit you did I sit as it, sikikatit guided is the kakwitis it it's the saying not worth a continental. For additional documents related to these topics, search loc.gov using such keywords as slaves, blacks. Indians use savages and specific tribes such as Mohawk, Iroquois, or Six Nations. Loyalists and Tory, women, and economy, including paper, currency, depreciation, and inflation, and use. The terms found in the documents. Note that using these terms alone will produce thousands of hits each. Therefore, try to use these keywords in specific collections and with more specific modifiers, such as dates or places. Revolutionary War. Groping toward peace. 1781 to 1783, asterisk, the year 1781 was momentous for the American Revolution. The beginning of the year, arguably, witnessed perhaps the low point of American morale during the Revolution. The people are discontented, George Washington wrote to John Laurens in early 1781. But it is with the feeble and oppressive mode of conducting the war, not with the war itself. Indeed, Washington now believed that it was critical for the United States and its French allies to achieve a significant military victory in 1781, or all might be lost because of the state of American public opinion. Even so, Washington could not have foreseen the events that eventually unfolded during the year, nor could he appreciate their significance as they occurred. Indeed, most of the year continued to be characterized by inactivity of the French and most of the Continental armies. Only when the brilliant strategic activities of General Nathaniel Greene in North Carolina forced British General Cornwallis to march into Virginia did an opportunity open for Washington to achieve the military victory he had hoped for at the start of the year in Virginia on the Yorktown Peninsula. Cornwallis found himself cornered by the combined forces of Washington's Continental Army and the French Army and French fleet. These forces began siege operations against the British troops isolated at Yorktown. On October 17, 1781, Cornwallis sought terms of surrender. It is important to understand that the significance of the British surrender at Yorktown could not be fully appreciated by contemporaries. Washington called Yorktown an important victory and a glorious event, but he, like his compatriots, could not know what the British response would be to Cornwallis's surrender. Washington, the Continental Congress, and leaders in the states could only muddle along, waiting for events to unfold. In fact, Washington worried that the victory at Yorktown might diminish Americans' continued commitment to the war. For nearly the next 2 years, Washington would continue his efforts to keep the Continental Army intact, ready to fight if that became necessary. Meanwhile, peace talks between British and American diplomats got underway in Paris in May 1782 and continued into the fall. In September, the American negotiators, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, discovered that the French foreign minister had sent his secretary on a secret trip to London. Now convinced of French duplicity, Adams and Franklin let the British know that they were willing to negotiate unilaterally, that is, without French interference. After 2 months of difficult negotiations, the British and American diplomats signed the preliminary Articles of Peace on November 30, 1782, until a definitive peace treaty was signed. The United States was still technically at war. British and French fleets continued to fight on the high seas and in the Caribbean, but no land actions took place on the North American continent. The focus of the Patriots was on keeping the Continental Army intact in case the peace talks broke down. At this point, the greatest danger to the revolution was the officers of the Continental Army, nearly fed up with Congress inaction regarding their pay, among many other issues. Officers encamped at Newburgh, New York, sent a declaration to Congress concerning the pay issue. This was a serious threat. Washington diffused the threat by his personal prestige and by continuing to lobby Congress on behalf of his officers. For additional documents related to these topics, search loc.gov using such keywords as Charles Cornwallis, Nathaniel Greene, Yorktown, Newburgh, and Preliminary Articles of Peace. Search Washington's papers and the journals of the Continental Congress by date, and use the terms found in the documents. Neutrality Proclamation * on April 22, 1793. President George Washington issued a neutrality proclamation to define the policy of the United States in response to warfare in Europe, including the French Revolution. The proclamation stated that they, the United States, should with sincerity and good faith adopt and pursue a conduct friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers. 1. The proclamation warned Americans that the federal government would prosecute any violations of this policy by its citizens and would not protect them should they be tried by a belligerent nation. Washington feared the United States could be pulled into a foreign war, and any allegiance to a particular nation at war could adversely affect the economy. Rationale for the Neutrality Proclamation: this statement of policy triggered a fierce reaction from those who considered it a sellout of the nation's revolutionary impulses for the financial gain of the merchant class. The cause of France is the cause of man, and neutrality is desertion. One anonymous correspondent wrote the President. Too. Critics believe that the proclamation marked a betrayal of our oldest ally. The proclamation was important for presidential precedent as it established in the exertion of executive authority in the realm of foreign policy. Differing opinions on the policy excited partisan passions that were formative to the creation of political parties in the first-party system. Several important recent developments in both American and Europe led to Washington's neutrality proclamation. The French Revolution turned more radical as King Louis XVI was beheaded in January 1793. 10 days later, revolutionary France, already fighting Austria and Prussia, declared war on England, Holland, and Spain, embroiling the entire European continent in conflict. Lastly, on April 8, 1793, the new French minister, Goodman Jennett, arrived in Charleston, South Carolina. As the first French ambassador to the U.S., he actively instigated American involvement in France's conflict. In trying to secure private American funders for his cause, he contributed to the French neutrality crisis and the international incident became known as the Jennetta Affair. Deeply concerned with maintaining neutrality, Washington called his cabinet together on April 19, 1793, to solicit their advice. Despite some disagreement between Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton on other related issues, the four members of the cabinet unanimously agreed that the President could and should issue a statement affirming the neutrality of the United States in the European-wide war. Attorney General Edmund Randolph wrote the 293-word proclamation for the President's signature. Reaction to the Neutrality Proclamation *. The proclamation ignited a firestorm of criticism. Much of the American population sympathized with the cause of revolutionary France. In a series of letters written under the pseudonym of Pacificus, Alexander Hamilton took up the task of defending the administration in the press by arguing that neutrality was in the best interest of the United States. Furthermore, Hamilton asserted that the 1778 Treaty of Alliance was a defensive arrangement that was not applicable in 1793 because France had declared war on its enemies. An offensive act, aggravated by Hamilton's claims of broad executive power and frustrated by the language of Randolph's final draft of the proclamation. Thomas Jefferson organized a response to Pacificus. At the pleading of his friend and Secretary of State, Hamilton's former Federalist Papers collaborator, Congressman James Madison, took up the cause of the opposition in a series of letters under the pen name of Pontificus that countered the arguments of Pacificus. Madison and Hamilton provided each side of the growing partisan chasm between Federalists and the Democratic Republicans with powerful talking points. The controversy moved from the pages of newspapers to the courts when the federal government charged Gideon Henfield, an American citizen who joined a French privateer crew, for violating the Neutrality Proclamation when he sailed a captured British prize vessel into port at Philadelphia. Minister Jennett championed Henfield's cause and funded a highly talented legal team to defend him. The jury ruled that Henfield was not guilty because the defendant had violated no statute. In other words, the jury considered the proclamation as a statement of policy that failed to carry the weight of law. Attorney General Randolph wasted no time in voicing the administration position that despite the embarrassing outcome of the trial, the increasingly unpopular policy of neutrality still stood. The tide of public opinion shifted dramatically in July 1793, when Jennett refused to recognize the authority of the federal government by converting a captured else British vessel into a French warship in the United States. In a meeting with Secretary of State, Jennett even threatened to appeal directly to the American people to act against Washington. Hamilton leaked this damaging information to political allies in New York, who published it. Jennett had gone too far. Popular sentiment rallied around in favor of the president. The Neutrality Act of 1794. Congress remedied the situation of the proclamation's legal limbo in 1794 by passing the Neutrality Act, which gave President Washington's policy the force of law. The act marked an acknowledgement by the legislative branch that foreign policy resided largely in the constitutional domain of the executive. With the legal and constitutional questions settled, the partisan contentions over the French Revolution and foreign policy channeled into other issues, such as the even more bitter debate over Jay's Treaty the following year. On July 7, 1798, during the quasi-war crisis in the presidency of John Adams, Congress formally annulled the 20-year-old Treaty of Alliance with France. Sovereignty and neutrality in 1807, the newly independent United States sought to stay neutral during the Napoleonic Wars between France and the United Kingdom. However, harsh constraints on trade and incessant British attacks on American shipping have left the United States questioning how it can exercise its freedom from European entanglements. Students will understand that although the United States won the American Revolutionary War, it was not fully free from Europe. Even in the newly independent United States, unrestricted trade and liberation from European infringements on American independence could not be guaranteed. Use the following historical case to spark discussion and help students think through what they would do if they were decision makers. The Situation Act. The outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars between France and a Britain-led coalition in 1803. The United States was still in its first decades of independence. The priority for the fledgling nation was to protect its newly gained sovereignty. This was no simple task. The new country remained militarily and economically weak compared to the European powers. At the time, the British Navy comprised over 500 warships. The United States, for comparison, had fewer than 20. Unprepared and unwilling to be drawn into a European conflict, the United States sought to protect its interests by remaining neutral in the war in Europe. Simultaneously, The United States relied on trade with both France and the United Kingdom as a vital driver of economic growth. Previous conflicts between France and the United Kingdom had proven advantageous to the U.S. economy, as both countries depended on imports of U.S. raw materials to fuel their war efforts. American exports grew nearly tenfold between 1793 and 1806. By 1806, however, maintaining both neutrality and trade grew difficult. France and the United Kingdom imposed blockades to strangle each other's economies and to deprive access to critical materials. In theory, international maritime laws at the time protected a neutral country's right to trade. This did not stop British ships from harassing American shipping and seizing U.S. cargo. However, the British Navy also began forcing American sailors into British military service, a practice known as impressment. The British claimed impressed sailors were deserters from the Royal Navy. However, the British paid little attention in practice to whether impressed sailors were British or U.S. citizens. By 1807, more than 6,000 U.S. citizens had been impressed into the Royal Navy. British practices were met with outrage in the United States. With the capacity to conduct trade severely limited, the U.S. economy suffered. Moreover, Americans saw British practices as a violation of American sovereignty. Moreover, policies like impressment expressed blatant disregard for the United States' hard-won independence. Despite growing outrage, the Thomas Jefferson administration remained wary of drawing the United States back into a war with a superior force. Even with the bulk of British forces occupied fighting France, such a war could be devastating. Conflict with Britain could ravage the U.S. economy, threaten the lives of thousands of U.S. citizens, and risk ending in reoccupation by the United States' former colonial ruler. With the European war showing no sign of letting up and British aggression on the seas mounting, the United States feared even a small escalation or miscalculation could draw into a position that would require action or become a flashpoint. Igniting war. Set on June 25, 1807, off the coast of Virginia. The British HMS Leopard fired upon and boarded the USS Chesapeake, an American warship. 3 Americans were killed in the assault, 18 were injured, and several others were impressed into British naval service. News of the incident has brought already simmering tensions over British shipping practices to a boil. As a result, many Americans are openly calling for war with the United Kingdom. U.S. forces have begun to plan the defense of critical positions should the incident prove to be the first clash of a larger war. President Jefferson has called a cabinet meeting to decide how to respond to this latest in a series of British affronts. As they deliberate, advisors will need to consider how to protect U.S. interests and assert U.S. sovereignty. Meanwhile, cabinet members must also take into account the risks of entering a war with a stronger power. Cabinet members should consider any combination of the following policy options: economic measures, including increased tariffs or an outright embargo on trade with European countries. Ceasing trade could coerce the United Kingdom into allowing unrestricted trade between the United States and Europe. This policy option could halt the impressment of Americans and keep American vessels out of harm's way. However, such an embargo is not guaranteed to work. Moreover, tariffs or embargoes would deepen economic hardship in the United States before forcing British action. Diplomatic measures, including negotiations with the British pursuing either an apology or reparations for the incident. Ideally, this policy option would include a broader agreement, easing British restrictions on trade and abolishing impressment. This option could protect U.S. trade, assert U.S. sovereignty, and avert a war. Without any leverage, however, favorable agreement would be unlikely, given previous British indifference toward American sovereignty. Negotiations could also take time, during which British practices could continue and public outrage could grow over the lack of a forceful response. Military action. including building up U.S. military and naval forces to defend against further attacks or immediately declaring war against the United Kingdom. This option would most forcefully assert U.S. sovereignty, but has the most risks. Even with the bulk of British forces occupied fighting France, the U.S. military is underprepared for a war with the United Kingdom. Swift military buildup would be costly. Tenskwatawa, Tenskwatawa, Tenskwatwi, also called Tenskwatawa, or Lalawethika, January 1775, November 1836, was a Native American religious and political leader of the Shawnee tribe, known as the Prophet or the Shawnee Prophet. He was a younger brother of Tecumseh, a leader of the Shawnee. In his early years, Tenskwatawa was given the name Lalawethika. He makes a loud noise, or the noisemaker. But he changed it around 1805 and transformed himself from a hapless, alcoholic youth into an influential spiritual leader. Tenskwatawa denounced the Americans, calling them the offspring of the evil spirit, and led a purification movement that promoted unity among the indigenous peoples of North America, rejected acculturation to the American way of life, and encouraged his followers to pursue traditional ways. In the early 1800s, Tenskwatawa formed a community with his followers near Greenville in western Ohio. And in 1808, he and Tecumseh established a village that the Americans called Prophetstown, north of present-day Lafayette, Indiana. At Prophetstown, the Brothers' Pan-American Indian Resistance movement increased to include thousands of followers, and Tenskwatawa provided the spiritual foundation. Together, they mobilized the American Indians in the Northwest Territory to fight the Americans, and they remained resolute in their rejection of American authority and acculturation. On November 7, 1811, while Tecumseh was away, Tenskwatawa ordered the pre-dawn attack on a hostile, encroaching American military force encamped near Prophetstown that initiated the Battle of Tippecanoe. The American Indians retreated after a 2-hour engagement and abandoned Prophetstown, which the Americans burned to the ground. The battle did not end the American Indians' resistance against the United States, but the Prophet lost his influence, became an outcast, and moved to Canada during the War of 1812, after Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. The American Indian resistance movement faltered and was eventually defeated. Tenskwatawa remained as an exile in Canada for nearly a decade. He returned to the United States in 1824 to assist the U.S. government with the Shawnee removal to reservation land in present-day Kansas. The aging prophet arrived at the Shawnee Reservation in 1828 and faded into obscurity. Tenskwatawa died at what is known as the Argentine district of present-day Kansas City, Kansas, in 1836. Early life and family. Lalawethika, he makes a loud noise or noisemaker, who as an adult changed his name to Tenskwatawa, open door, or one with open mouth, was one of a set of triplet brothers born in early 1775 to Pukishinwa and Methotesk in a Shawnee village along the Mad River in western Ohio. One of the triplets died within the first year of his birth. But Tenskwatawa and his surviving triplet, Tecumseh, were members of a family that included at least 8 children, 3 daughters, and 5 sons. Lalawethika's early years showed no evidence of the powerful spiritual leader he would become as an adult. Instead, his sad and isolated youth was marked by numerous failures and alcoholism. Tenskwatawa's father, Atinyoa, something that Falls, was a leader of the Dispossession division of the Shawnee tribe. He was killed fighting against the Virginia militia in the Battle of Point Pleasant before Tenskwatawa was born. His mother, Methotesk, or Methoteski, meaning one who lays eggs in the sand, is believed to be either Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, or Shawnee, possibly of Pequot division and the Turtle Clan. Methotesk, who was frightened by the American Revolution and deeply saddened by the death of Puckinshinwa, may have gone to live with her Creek relatives and then moved west with the Kispacothas in 1779. leaving Tenskwatawa and his siblings in the care of their older sister, Tecumseh, who was married. Tenskwatawa, who was not as successful or brave as his brothers, was a failure at almost everything he attempted during his youth. When Tecumseh, his oldest brother and a leading warrior, took his brothers out to hunt and fight in small battles, Tenskwatawa stayed behind because he lacked competence as a skilled hunter and warrior. Tenskwatawa was never able to distinguish himself as a hunter or fighter as Tecumseh, another of his older brothers. Tecumseh, who was 7 years older, was an especially gifted athlete who became the favorite of most of the tribe. In contrast, Tenskwatawa was isolated, unpopular, and depressed by his lack of success. He began drinking alcohol, which further lowered his self-esteem and increased his problems. He also blinded himself in his right eye with his own arrow when he was younger. Lonely and insecure, Tenskwatawa attempted to make up for his deficiencies by boasting and making up stories about how talented and important he was. His depression and alcoholism worsened as he grew older, making him unable to provide for his wife and several children. In 1794, 19-year-old Tenskwatawa was present at the Battle of Fallen Timbers with two of his brothers, Tecumseh and Sawaziko, but he did not distinguish himself as a warrior. Instead, Tenskwatawa viewed the battle as a chance to reinsert himself into tribal society. In his late 20s, he decided to become a medicine man and apprenticed with a tribal healer, Penagashia, changing feathers. However, when Tenskwatawa was unable to save his people after they fell seriously ill, probably with influenza, he became humiliated and even more depressed. By the early 1800s, Tenskwatawa had developed a reputation as a notorious drunk among the Shawnee living along the White River. Purification movement leader in 1795. After the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Indians of the Old Northwest signed the Treaty of Greenville with the American government, in which they agreed to surrender most of modern Ohio. In return, the American government promised to allow them to retain the remainder of the Northwest Territory forever. After 1803, however, the main official in the Northwest, William Henry Harrison, began pressuring the tribes of the Old Northwest to cede more land west of the Greenville line. President Thomas Jefferson and Harrison tried to pressure the tribes into adopting Euro-American customs, especially European-style farming. They hoped that such acculturation would make the tribes more willing to cede additional land, but also believed that they could force the tribes into acculturating by pressuring them to cede more of their remaining territory. To this end, Jefferson encouraged American officials in the Northwest to deliberately entrap the tribes of the region in debt to force them to cede land. Many established chiefs, such as Black Hoof and Little Turtle, encouraged their followers to adopt European customs and tried to maintain good relations with the American government. After 1803, Harrison convinced some pro-accommodation chiefs to cede large areas of land west of the Greenville line. The American government paid for these cessions with annuities, which it placed under the control of the pro-accommodation chiefs. Many Indians saw these payments as bribes to the pro-accommodation chiefs. These land cessions were also controversial because the American government generally paid the tribes far less than the market price of the land which it acquired. Moreover, Harrison often bought land from tribes which had relatively weak claims to it, while ignoring the stronger claims of other tribes. Meanwhile, Euro-American settlers rapidly moved onto the lands which the tribes of the Old Northwest had not yet ceded. Many settlers sold alcohol to the tribes, contributing to a growing problem of drunkenness. The land cessions, along with these trends, contributed to growing discontent among the tribes of the Old Northwest and gradually undermined the authority of the pro-accommodation chiefs. The stage was thus set for the emergence of a nativist movement. Beginning in 1805, Lalawethika had a series of religious visions that transformed his life, caused him to change his name to Tenskwatawa, meaning open door, and led him to reject his old ways. He experienced his first vision in May 1805, when he fell into unconsciousness during one of his alcoholic stupors and was thought to be dead. Unexpectedly reviving as his body was being prepared for burial, he recounted a powerful vision of two different worlds. One filled with ample blessings for the virtuous ones who lived as the master of life intended, while the other world was filled with pain, hardship, and terror for those who refused to follow traditional tribal ways. Tenskwatawa became known as the Prophet, began preaching, and gathered a growing number of followers. He soon emerged as a powerful and influential spiritual leader. More visions followed in succeeding months, including revelations that the European invaders from the east were the children of the evil spirit. The Prophet's developing purification movement caused him to urge his followers to reject European habits, such as consumption of alcohol, and to return to their traditional ways. He wanted his people to reject the white man's customs by forbidding marriages between Indians and whites, as well as the use of Euro-American foods, clothing, and manufactured goods. Tenskwatawa also encouraged his people to follow traditional gender roles: women as farmers, men as hunters and warriors. Tenskwatawa proved to be harsh, even brutal, in his treatment of those who opposed him and his teachings. He accused his detractors and anyone who associated with settlers of witchcraft, including Indians who had converted to Christianity. For Tenskwatawa, Indian witches remained the most active agents of the evil spirits on earth, and he sought to identify and destroy them. Politics at home. Hawks, Doves, and Sectional Storms, 1808 to 1812 Democratic-Republican Party. First opposition political party in the United States. Organized in 1792 as the Republican Party. Its members held power nationally between 1801 and 1825. It was the direct antecedent of the present Democratic Party. Asterisk during the two administrations of press. George Washington, 1789 to 97. Many former anti-federalists who had resisted adoption of the new federal Constitution 1787 began to unite in opposition to the fiscal program of Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. After Hamilton and other proponents of a strong central government and a loose interpretation of the Constitution formed the Federalist Party in 1791. Those who favored states' rights and a strict interpretation of the Constitution rallied. Under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson, who had served as Washington's first Secretary of State. Jefferson's supporters, deeply influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution 1789, first adopted the name Republican to emphasize their anti-monarchical views. The Republicans contended that the Federalists harbored aristocratic attitudes, and that their policies placed too much power in the central government and tended to benefit the affluent at the expense of the common man. Although the Federalists soon branded Jefferson's followers Democratic Republicans, attempting to link them with the excesses of the French Revolution. The Republicans officially adopted the derisive label in 1798. The Republican Coalition supported France in the European War that broke out in 1792. While the Federalists supported Britain's French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The Republicans' opposition to Britain unified the faction through the 1790s and inspired them to fight against the Federalist-sponsored Treaty 1794 and the Alien and Sedition Acts 1798. Notwithstanding the party's anti-elitist foundations. The first three Democratic-Republican presidents, Jefferson, 1801–09, James Madison, 1809–17, and James Monroe, 1817–25, were all wealthy, aristocratic Southern planters, though all three shared the same liberal political philosophy. Jefferson narrowly defeated the Federalist John Adams in the election of 1800. His victory demonstrated that power could be transferred peacefully between parties under the Constitution. Once in office, the Democratic Republicans attempted to scale back Federalist programs, but actually overturned few of the institutions they had criticized. For example, the Bank of the United States was retained until its charter expired in 1811. Nevertheless, Jefferson made a genuine effort to make his administration appear more democratic and egalitarian. He walked to the Capitol for his inauguration rather than ride in a Cochin 6, and he sent his annual message to Congress by messenger rather than reading it personally. Federal excises were repealed, the national debt was retired, and the size of the armed forces was greatly reduced. However, the demands of foreign relations, such as the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, often forced Jefferson and his successors into a nationalistic stance reminiscent of the Federalists. Asterisk in the 20 years after 1808. The party existed less as a united political group than as a loose coalition of personal and sectional factions. The fissures in the party were fully exposed by the election of 1824. When the leaders of the two major factions, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, were both nominated for president. Meanwhile, William H. Crawford was nominated by the party's Congressional Caucus, and Henry Clay, another Democratic Republican, was nominated by the Kentucky and Tennessee legislatures. Jackson carried the popular vote and a plurality in the Electoral College. But because no candidate received a majority of the electoral vote, the presidency was decided by the House of Representatives. Clay, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, finished fourth and was thus ineligible for consideration. He subsequently threw his support to Adams, who was elected president and promptly appointed Clay Secretary of State. Following the election, the Democratic Republicans split into two groups: the National Republicans, who became the nucleus of the Whig Party in the 1830s, were led by Adams and Clay, while the Democratic Republicans were organized by Martin Van Buren, the future 8th president, 1837-41, and led by Jackson. The Democratic Republicans comprised diverse elements that emphasized local and humanitarian concerns, states' rights, agrarian interests, and democratic procedures. During Jackson's presidency, 1829-37, they dropped the Republican label and called themselves simply Democrats or Jacksonian Democrats. The name Democratic Party was formally adopted in 1844. Federalists, the Federalist, commonly referred to as the Federalist Papers, is a series of 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison between October 1787 and May 1788. The essays were published anonymously, under the pen name Publius. In various New York State newspapers of the time, the Federalist Papers were written and published to urge New Yorkers to ratify the proposed United States Constitution, which was drafted in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. In lobbying for adoption of the Constitution over the existing Articles of Confederation, the essays explain particular provisions of the Constitution in detail. For this reason, and because Hamilton and Madison were each members of the Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers are often used today to help interpret the intentions of those drafting the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were published primarily in two New York State newspapers, the New York Packet and the Independent Journal. They were reprinted in other newspapers in New York State and in several cities in other states. About Edition with revisions and corrections by Hamilton, published in 1788 by printers J. and A. McLean. An edition published by printer Jacob Gideon in 1818, with revisions and corrections by Madison, was the first to identify each essay by its author's name. Because of its publishing history, the assignment of authorship, numbering, and exact wording may vary with different editions of the Federalist. The electronic text of the Federalist used here was compiled for Project Gutenberg by scholars who drew on many available versions of the papers. One printed edition of the text is the Federalist. Edited by Jacob E. Cook, Middletown Con, Wesleyan University Press, 1961. Cook's introduction provides background information on the printing history of the Federalist. The information provided above comes in part from his work. This web-friendly presentation of the original text of the Federalist Papers, also known as the Federalist, was obtained from the e-text archives of Project Gutenberg. Any irregularities with regard to grammar, syntax, spelling, or punctuation are as they exist in the original e-text archives. Warhawk. In U.S. history, any of the expansionists primarily composed of young Southerners and Westerners. Elected to the U.S. Congress in 1810, whose territorial ambitions in the Northwest and Florida inspired them to agitate for war with Great Britain. The Warhawks, who included such future political leaders as Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, fiercely and aggressively resented American economic injuries and national humiliation during the Napoleonic Wars. They were further indignant over British encouragement of Indian hostilities toward settlers in the Northwest and hoped to use war with England to wrest Florida from Spain, Britain's ally. The nationalistic fervor and anti-British sentiment whipped up by the Warhawks was a contributing cause to the War of 1812. Henry Clay, born April 12, 1777. Hanover County, Virginia, U.S. deed, June 29, 1852. Washington, D.C., was an American statesman, U.S. Congressman, Ye Ba Yao 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 Si, Yi Ba Yi Wu Arshi, Yi Ba Arsen Arshu Wu. 1849-52, who was noted for his American system, which integrated a national bank, the tariff, and internal improvements to promote economic stability and prosperity, and was a major promoter of the Missouri Compromise 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, both efforts to shield the American Union from sectional discord over slavery. Clay was an unsuccessful candidate for president in 3 general elections, running first in 1824, then as a national Republican 1832, and finally as a Whig 1844. Early years. Clay was born on a modest farm in Virginia. During the American Revolution, he was the 4th of 5 surviving siblings. His father, a tobacco farmer and Baptist minister, died when Clay was 4 years old. But his mother remarried, and Clay's youth was relatively comfortable. Campaign biographies later portrayed him as rising from poverty, but that depiction ignored inadequate education and family connections that landed him a clerkship under the celebrated Virginia jurist George Wythe, the judge of the state chancery court in Richmond. Wythe introduced Clay to the law and arranged for his legal instruction under State Attorney General and former Governor Robert Brooke. Clay proved a quick study and was admitted to the bar in 1797. The glut of lawyers in Richmond persuaded him to follow his family to Kentucky, where they had moved in 1791. Clay settled in Lexington in 1797 and soon had a thriving law practice, in addition to handling lucrative cases dealing with disputed land titles. Clay developed a commanding courtroom presence that made him a formidable defense attorney. In 1821, he was the first attorney to file an amicus curiae friend of the court brief with the U.S. Supreme Court. He was also possibly the first attorney to use a successful plea of temporary insanity to save from the gallows a client accused of murder. Those strategies were among the innovations that marked him as a legal pioneer. John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, born March 18, 1782. Abbeville District, South Carolina, U.S. deed, March 31, 1850. Washington, D.C. was an American political leader who was a congressman, the Secretary of War, the 7th Vice President, 1825-32, a senator, and the Secretary of State of the United States. He championed states' rights in slavery and was a symbol of the Old South. Calhoun was born to Patrick Calhoun, a well-to-do Scots-Irish farmer, and Martha Caldwell, both of whom had recently migrated from Pennsylvania to the Carolina Piedmont. 2 years after enrolling in a local academy at age 18, he entered the junior class at Yale College, where he graduated with distinction. After a year at a law school and further study in the office of a prominent member of the Federalist Party in Charleston, South Carolina, he was admitted to the bar, but abandoned his practice after his marriage in 1811 to his cousin, Floride Bonneau Calhoun, an heiress whose modest fortune enabled him to become a planter-statesman, an ardent Jeffersonian Republican who called for war with Britain as early as 1807. Calhoun was elected to South Carolina's state legislature in 1808 and to the United States House of Representatives in 1811. There he functioned as a main lieutenant of Speaker Henry Clay, and, in his capacity as chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, he introduced the declaration of war against Britain in June 1812. His service as Majority Floor Leader during the War of 1812 led a colleague to call him the Young Hercules, who carried the war on his shoulders. Legislative zigzags. Non-Intercourse Act 1809 replaces the embargo, banning trade with Britain and France only. Evasion rampant. Cons Bill No. 2 1810 dangles a carrot if either belligerent lifts restrictions. The U.S. will embargo. The other, Napoleon claims compliance. Madison, eager for leverage, bites. Britain, skeptical of French honesty, holds firm. The Little Belt Affair, May 16, 1811. Skirmish between USS President and HMS Little Belt leaves blood on the water. Side blaming the other for firing first. Trust erodes further. Elections. Of 1810 to 1811, war-leaning legislators surge into Congress. Madison, cautious by temperament, feels the political tide turn. Napoleonic Wars and the United States, 1803 to 1815 *. The Napoleonic Wars continued the wars of the French Revolution. Great Britain and France fought for European supremacy and treated weaker powers heavy-handedly. The United States attempted to remain neutral during the Napoleonic period, but eventually became embroiled in the European conflicts, leading to the War of 1812 against Great Britain. Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in 1799 after overthrowing the French revolutionary government. During this time, U.S. and French negotiators were concluding negotiations to end the Quasi-War with France. In 1802, Napoleon ended 10 years of warfare with Great Britain under the Peace of Amiens. He used this opportunity to attempt to crush the Haitian Revolution, but the army he sent met with defeat. Napoleon had also reobtained the North American province of Louisiana from Spain in 1800. However, the loss of Haiti made Louisiana strategically undesirable, and with war again on the horizon with Great Britain, Napoleon was willing to agree to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, as expected. Britain declared war on France in 1803 and would remain at war for over a decade. During this period of war, Napoleon and British leaders concentrated on European affairs. But the conflict spilled over into the Atlantic. From 1803 to 1806, the United States succeeded in remaining neutral, but suffered from impressment. British seizure of British-born naturalized U.S. citizens into the British Navy. President Thomas Jefferson sent William Pinckney and James Monroe to negotiate a treaty that would halt the impressment of American sailors. But when the signed treaty came back without any British concessions on the impressment issue, Jefferson did not pass it on to the Senate for ratification in 1806. Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, which forbade trade with Britain, and the British government responded the next year with Orders in Council, which instituted a blockade of French-controlled Europe and authorized the British Navy to seize ships violating the blockade. Napoleon responded with further trade restrictions in the Milan Decree of 1807. U.S. relations with Great Britain became increasingly rocky during this period. On June 22, 1807, the HMS Leopard bombarded and forcibly boarded the USS Chesapeake, off Norfolk, Virginia, in search of British Navy deserters. President Jefferson responded with an embargo on all foreign trade in an effort to weaken the British economy. The embargo was extremely unpopular in New England, where the economy was heavily dependent on trade with Britain. Moreover, the British economy was not strongly affected by the embargo, which proved difficult to enforce. In early 1809, in one of his final acts as president, Jefferson replaced the embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act, which allowed trade with other nations except Britain and France. This act also proved virtually impossible to enforce. Jefferson's successor, President James Madison, confronted a dilemma: to continue with the ineffective Non-Intercourse Act was effectively to submit to British terms of trade, since the British Navy controlled the Atlantic. Madison was assisted by the passage in 1810 of Nathaniel Bacon's Bill No. 2, which offered Britain and France the option of ceasing their seizure of U.S. merchant ships in return for U.S. participation in their trade. Bloc Napoleon was the first to offer concessions, which Madison publicly accepted at face value, despite his private skepticism. In doing so, Madison pushed the United States closer to war with Britain. During this period, Madison also had to address a problem created by Secretary of State Robert Smith, who had personally stated to the British minister his pro-British sympathies. When Madison confronted Smith and offered him a graceful departure as US minister to Russia, Smith appeared to accept his offer, and then leaked cabinet papers as part of a smear campaign against President Madison. U.S. diplomat Joel Barlow published a reply and swung public opinion against Smith, who resigned on April 1, 1811. Relations with Great Britain continued to deteriorate. A U.S. Navy ship mistook a much smaller British ship, the HMS Little Belt, for a British Navy ship that had impressed American sailors and fired upon it. Consequently, Thomas Foster, British minister to the United States, stated that Britain would not offer any compensation for the 1807 Chesapeake incident. Foster also informed Madison that the British government would not revoke the orders in council. By the spring of 1812, Madison had decided upon war with Great Britain, though he also considered declaring war on France as well. Congress passed a declaration of war on June 17, which Madison signed the next day. The war continued into 1815. Although diplomats signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 23, 1814, the Napoleonic Wars marked a period of U.S. weakness in the face of British power. However, in the post-war period, British policies began to soften, leading to the Rush-Bagot Agreement and the Convention of 1818. The spark to the powder, Spring-Summer 1812 escalation checklist. Impressment incidents pile up. American outrage renews with each seizure. Western and Southern congressmen tied to Tippecanoe and frontier violence to British intrigue. Economic pain from years of embargoes and seizures convinces many that negotiation has failed. June 1, 1812. Madison's war message. President James Madison lists grievances. Impressment. Violations of neutral trade, blockades. Fomenting native hostilities. He stopped short of demanding Canadian annexation. The case is framed as rights and national honor. June 18, 1812. War declared. The House and Senate approve narrowly, and along sectional lines, New England Federalists oppose. The United States enters war with the greatest naval power on earth, with few ships and uneven preparations. Crucial irony. Britain rescinds the most hated commercial restrictions almost simultaneously. But the ships bearing that news will not reach America for weeks. Visuals, Madison's hand signing, parchment close-ups, polling maps coloring by region. A packet ship beating into headwinds. Why war? Competing explanations. 1. Maritime rights. An impressment core cause. The United States insisted that free ships make free goods and that naturalized Americans were Americans. Britain's practice of stopping vessels and seizing sailors, sometimes truly British. sometimes not became the moral center of the American case, point to economic warfare. Orders in council and French decrees made neutral trade nearly impossible. American merchants saw fortunes wrecked. Farmers saw markets vanish. 3. Frontier security and native resistance, Americans believed. British Canada supplied and encouraged native resistance. Britain saw it as pragmatic diplomacy. In the U.S., the linkage hardened into a casus belli point for expansionism. Contested, some leaders spoke cavalierly of marching to Canada, expecting a quick capitulation. For others, Canada was leveraged to force Britain to the table. Historians disagree over how central annexationist aims were. But war planning undeniably targeted Canada. 5. Domestic politics and honor. The war hawks elevated national honor, arguing that a republic that tolerated insults would not long remain free. Federalists warned that honor would bankrupt commerce and empower the South and West. 6. Timing and miscommunication. Policy shifts in London and mixed signals from Paris repeatedly crossed with American decisions. A pattern of too little, too late magnified every grievance. Takeaway: no single spark explains. 1812. It was a convergence. Maritime law colliding with total war. Expansion meeting resistance, and a young nation defining its sovereignty. The hard way. Asterisk, the cast of the crisis, James Madison, intellectual president. Architect of the Constitution, cautious but cornered by grievances in Congress. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, charismatic warhawks channeling frontier anger and national pride. Albert Gallatin, Treasury Secretary, alarmed by the fiscal strain, yet supportive of firm policy. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, builders of a panitive vision to halt dispossession, sought British partnership without subservience. Sir George Prevost and Isaac Brock, British-Canadian commanders, balancing defense with limited resources. British Cabinet Admiralty, focused on Napoleon, slow to compromise at sea, quick to defend blockades. New England Federalists, merchants and shipowners fearing ruin and opposing war. Visuals, portraits with living history vignettes. Quotes very short to avoid overquoting. Maps marking each figure's sphere. Asterisk, a timeline of the fuse quick beats 1763. Proclamation line announced. 1793. U.S. neutrality. British and French wartime decrees begin. 1794-95. Jay Treaty. Eases some tensions, but leaves core issues unresolved. 1803-1807, Napoleon's empire peaks. Britain's naval blockades harden. June 22, 1807, Chesapeake Leopard Affair. December 1807, U.S. embargo. Act. 1809, Non-Intercourse Act. May 1810, Macon's Bill. No. 2. 1810-11. Warhawks rise in Congress. May 16, 1811. Little Belt Skirmish. November 7, 1811. Tippecanoe. June 1, 1812. Madison's War Message. June 16. 1812. British suspend orders in council, partial, conditional. June 18, 1812. U.S. declares war. Late June-July 1812. News of British policy change arrives too late. Asterisk myths, realities, and the Second War of Independence. Myth. The war was simply a land grab for Canada. Reality. Some Americans expected easy conquest, but the declared grievances centered on maritime rights and frontier security. Expansionist rhetoric existed, but it was not the public legal case. Myth. Britain deliberately provoked America to war. Reality. Britain preferred U.S. neutrality. The Royal Navy's harsh practices were driven by survival needs against Napoleon. It's not a desire to fight America. Net. Native resistance was merely a British puppet. Reality. Native nations pursued their own strategic goals. British support was real but limited and often inconsistent, framing the Second War of Independence. The phrase resonates because Americans fought for the recognition of their sovereignty on the seas and borders, not just on parchment, yet calling it a clean sequel oversimplifies a messy, globalized crisis. Asterisk. What if? The narrow paths not taken faster diplomacy. If London's rollback of trade orders had been known in Washington before June 18th, war might have been delayed or reshaped. A different frontier, a durable native buffer state, backed consistently by Britain might have deterred U.S. expansion or intensified confrontation sooner. Domestic compromise. A stronger bipartisan maritime policy compensation tribunals. Joint commissions could have reduced incidents, but not Britain's core manpower problem. Asterisk, setting the stage for the war itself's state of forces. Meade 1812. U.S. Navy, tiny but well-built heavy frigates. Crews motivated. Doctrine favors single-ship actions. U.S. Army, militia, understrength, uneven training, political appointees in command. Optimistic plans to take Canada. Britain, world's dominant navy, stretched thin. Canadian defense relies on a small regular force, militia, native allies, and control of inland waters, strategic theaters fixed by origins, Atlantic and Caribbean, where impressment and convoy rights will be tested. Great Lakes and St. Lawrence, where British native cooperation counters. U.S. plans, Gulf and Spanish Florida, smoldering edges, tied to U.S. southern ambitions and Spanish decline. Closing thought of the origins of the war that follows, glories. Single-ship duels, burning capitals, and boundary fights makes better headlines. But its true beginning lies in crowded docks, boardrooms, council houses, and cabinet tables where law, commerce, and sovereignty tangled into a knot only war would cut. Asterisk echoes after 1812 brief. The war ends in status quo anti-borders treaty of Ghent, 1814. But impressment fades as the Napoleonic struggle ends, suggesting Britain's practice was about European war exigency more than American defiance. U.S. nationalism surges. The Navy earns lasting prestige. For native nations allied with Britain, losses are catastrophic. The dream of a protected homeland in the Old Northwest is broken. Anglo-American relations, paradoxically, stabilize after the ordeal, opening a century of mostly peaceful coexistence. Final VO, origins matter. They tell us not only why wars begin, but what peace must settle. In 1812, the United States demanded recognition as a sovereign equal on the world's oceans and along its frontiers. It got that recognition, but at a price most heavily paid. In the interior, where the war's deepest origins were always felt.